Research into global conflict indicates that more countries are at war today than at any time since World War II. Incoming US President Donald Trump, NATO and the EU all want to increase military spending, which hit record levels worldwide again last year. What are the implications? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Imran Khan. The world's experiencing levels of war not seen in decades, according to research from organisations that track global trends. Every day, people in Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo, amongst many others, are suffering the consequences of politics and diplomacy failing. Global military spending hit record levels last year. However, NATO, the EU and the next US President Donald Trump are pushing for further increases. But others, like Ireland's president, say more militarisation just means more risk of war. As the profits of arms companies rise, so too do levels of global hunger and poverty, often linked to the conflict. So where does the world stand? Ready for greater defence or poised for more violence? Is the spectre of World War III the stuff of fiction or nearer reality? We'll speak to our guests shortly, but first this report from Victoria Gatenby.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Israel's war on Gaza are two reasons why the world is less peaceful now than at any other time since World War II. That's according to the Institute for Economics and Peace. It says there are currently 56 conflicts globally. 92 countries are involved in fighting outside their borders, and in recent years, militarization has increased in more than 90 countries. A trend US President-elect Donald Trump appears to be encouraging.
Well, I think NATO should have 5%, yeah. Well, you can't do it at 2%. I mean, at 2%, every country, if you're going to have a country in a regular military, you're at 4%. I think they should be, they're in dangerous territory. I think it should be, they can all afford it, but they should be at 5%, not 2%. I'm the one that got them to pay 2%.
A divided international community has had little success in ending the conflicts in Sudan, Yemen, Gaza or Ukraine. Meanwhile, the number of civilians killed, either directly by the violence or indirectly from starvation and disease, continues to increase. Some say more military spending will just mean more war.
It is important that we respond to this rhetoric that calls for war as a state of mind, including the recent appalling comments from NATO calling for ever more armament spending to be achieved. This may, we were told, cause pain in the present so as to achieve security in the future.
The damage caused as a result of fighting comes with a hefty price tag. $19.1 trillion in 2023, representing more than 13% of global GDP. The human cost is catastrophic. In the same year, more than 160,000 people were killed and 110 million forced to flee their homes. Victoria Gatenby, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests from Stockholm. We're joined by Dan Smith, the director of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, a think tank focusing on global security. In New York, Ravi Agrawal, the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy magazine, and in Montreal is Mouin Rabbani, a non-resident fellow at the Centre for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies. Welcome to Inside Story. Let's start in Stockholm with Dan Smith. Dan, why is the world more dangerous than ever?
On the one hand, you've got the armed conflicts that your report was talking about. Combined with that, although the levels of nuclear warheads have carried on falling for the last 25 to 30 years, unfortunately, we've seen a slight uptick in the number of operational warheads that are being deployed. And that is probably presaging a new nuclear arms race. We also have the levels of military spending that you were talking about. Each year for the past 9 years has broken a record. And the 9-year run of increases is the longest that our databases can show. And then I think lastly, you've got to think that in the background to all of this is an ecological crisis of stunning proportions, not just about climate change, but about the loss of biodiversity, about air pollution, and about many other issues. So these things combine to create a kind of cocktail of risk that the world leaders do not yet show really clear signs of being able to handle.
I mean, talking about world leaders, let's bring in Ravi Agrawal. One of your latest articles has been talking about Donald Trump and transactionalism. He's about to come back into power. He's already said he wants more military spending, but more military spending isn't necessarily going to lead to peace or the end of these conflicts. These conflicts are going to go on because of local factors and international factors, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think the Trump administration, when it does start on January 20th, their whole point is that you can build peace through strength. And so that's sort of the rationale between a military buildup, not only in the United States, but among all of its allies in NATO and elsewhere. I think if you step back a bit from all of that, what we're seeing is over the last 75 years or so, the world order as it existed, with the United States as a clear hegemon, one of the only superpowers, has begun to see that sort of power erode in relative terms, not in absolute terms, in relative terms. And you see that most clearly now with China's rise, which the United States clearly sees as a threat. You see that also with the rise of other swing states, countries like India, other countries in the global south, which feel that they have more power. They want to test that power. Think of Russia, for example. And in this moment where countries are looking to test and see whether they can take more risks, whether they can test the extent and limits of the rules that exist, the norms that exist, as well as accusations fly that the United States itself doesn't follow the rules and has double standards, it creates a climate of impunity. It creates a climate where leaders, countries can try to literally test the boundaries of conflict. And I think that that's sort of the backdrop to why we are where we are, and it creates a climate then of adventurism of sorts. The essay I wrote, and thank you for mentioning it, it's the cover story of Foreign Policy magazine this time, is really about how Trump is defined by opportunism and transactionalism. And 2025 is not going to be like 2017. I think this time a lot of countries look at Trump's opportunism and they say, wait a minute, how do we make use of this for ourselves? The thing is, the countries that can make use of it are going to be countries with size, salience, and strength. Big countries, powerful countries. To Dan's point earlier, the countries that get ignored are the smaller ones, the ones that have no real agency to battle a climate in which we have more conflict, climate challenges are worsening, food crises are everywhere, and we are entering a more unequal world because of all of that.
Mouin Rabbani, there is an argument to be made, I think, and I'd like to ask you whether there is, that the Second World War didn't really come to an end, that all that really happened is we broke into wars in the world, rather than any kind of rules-based order, any kind of institutions that could deal with the world's problems. Are we at a stage where the United Nations, for example, has clearly failed?
Well, I think transition and upheaval always tend to go together. And I think the question we need to ask ourselves, are we seeing a growing number of challenges to the existing order, or are we seeing a fundamental transformation of that order towards something new and yet unknown? With respect to your question, I would disagree with the premise. I mean, a very clear bipolar international system was put in place in 1945, and you had, the Cold War, the United Nations Security Council, proxy wars throughout the Third World, whether in Southeast Asia or elsewhere. Those were very much the norms and rules of the game. And then that began to disintegrate with the end of the Cold War. But I would say, just regarding this report, it seems to go out of its way to recruit any evidence to make its case. So, for example, the report claims there are 45 armed conflicts in the Middle East. Well, considering that the authors don't consider Sudan as part of the Middle East, 45, I think, will be news to many specialists and observers to the region. But just to add to what this previous speaker said, this combination of instability, of transition, of growing inequality, one could add the multiplication of the number of states, for example, with the disintegration of first the Soviet Union and then Yugoslavia. So once again, are we simply seeing growing challenges to the existing system by powers that believe themselves to be able to act with complete impunity, like the United States and Great Britain and Iraq, or Israel now in the Gaza Strip? Or are we seeing a genuine disintegration of the international system that was put in place in 1945? And we're seeing the upheavals that go along with the transition to something that is as yet new and unknown.
Well, let me put that to Dan Smith. Dan Smith, the idea that the international institutions like the United Nations, like the Security Council, which is part of the United Nations, have failed because there is this idea that the big countries, the permanent members, for example, of the Security Council, can do what they wish, but they try and impose their will on smaller countries that are looking at them and just saying, well, actually, you don't do it, so we can do what we want.
Well, I mean, as you're suggesting, we have to take a look at this in terms of a historical perspective. So if you think of the past 70 years or so, 80 years since the end of the Second World War, and compare that to the interwar period between the First and Second World Wars, what you see is that there was an effort after the First World War to create a world order, which essentially collapsed within about 12 or 13 years, right? So then a revised effort was made with a lot of the same principles, but different operating methods, and the idea of the Security Council, the permanent members. At Stalin's insistence, the permanent members would have a veto of Security Council resolutions. And that has created something which I think is worth calling a world order, which has been flawed, but which has got some real achievements behind it. The Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the Genocide Convention, the Refugee Convention, a whole set of agencies, World Health Organization, UN Development Organization program, more recently UN Women. And so a whole set of achievements have been registered, but there have also been many flaws and failures. And one of the key flaws and failures, in the view of many observers, myself included, is that the UN Security Council, because there are 5 permanent members and because they have a veto on resolutions of the Security Council, they operate under one rather flexible, loose set of laws open to interpretation, so they can push against the rules every now and again, and the rest of the world operates under another much tighter set. Now, I think what is happening now, and probably will accelerate during the coming 4 years, because Trump is back in power and because he has as many objections to the world order of the last 8 decades as China, the leaders of China and Russia do, I think we are going to see an acceleration of the fraying of the international order, the weakening of it. And I'm really concerned about this. I mean, I don't see at the moment international institutions, UN bodies, able to intervene, to manage conflicts, as was happening in the 1990s and the noughts, as hadn't happened for the last decade or so. I think that the capacity to get through agreements on the ecological crisis and to implement them is visibly weakening. So although I think the UN agencies still carry on doing a terrific, sometimes a heroic job. I mean, think of the International Atomic Energy Agency and the work it's been doing to try and ensure some degree of nuclear safety in Ukraine, in the midst of a war. Despite the good work of some of the agencies, I think, yes, the international order is moving towards a moment of historic transition.
I want to take that to the other guest. Ravi, so It is flawed, but it's the only system that we've got. That is the United Nations, and therefore it needs to be protected, and more now so than ever. Is that right?
I think it's right, but I thought Dan put it really well right now. And I would go a little bit further and I say that, without throwing the baby out with the bathwater, it has significant achievements over the last 8 decades. It is just no longer fit for purpose. And that is okay. It is time to talk about how to reform not just the UN Security Council, but to make the United Nations more effective, more equitable. I think we're in this strange moment of global transition, of global flux, where a range of players, whether it's countries in the global south or countries in the rich world, whether it is people on the left or people on the right, there is an agreement that things aren't working as they are. And part of this diagnosis, whether it is the end of neoliberalism, the end of neoconservatism, whether it is a sneaking suspicion that globalization went too far and isn't quite working anymore, whether it is a sense that post-COVID countries need to secure their borders and focus on being protectionist, there's a real sense of agreement that the system as it isn't working. There is not much agreement on how to fix it. And this is where the left and the right, smaller countries and bigger countries, have no real sense of consensus. And part of the problem is, at its root is the UN Security Council, where you have 5 countries that have a veto power and refuse to give up that power. And that lends itself to accusations of double standards. It lends itself to accusations of trying to hoard power and not share it around, when all of the crises we have right now are so global, require global cooperation and global solutions. And we know this from the pandemic. We just haven't learned the lesson.
Mouin Rabbani, it's a very good point. The UN Security Council does need reform. There have been books written about this. There have been millions of gigabytes put on the internet about this very same topic. But ultimately, the 5 permanent members don't want any change because the system works for them. Once again, it's inequality that's driving decision-making. What are your thoughts on that? Is that sustainable?
Like any power structure, it can only be reformed through one of 2 ways. Either by the initiative or with the consent of those holding power within the system. And in the case of the Security Council, we know that that's simply never going to happen, or by effective challenges to that system. And that, I think, we have seen, and it's been very clear and very successful. The United States' illegal 2003 invasion and occupation and ultimately destruction of Iraq was, I think, by the account of most observers and analysts, the most clear-cut and brazen violation of the UN Charter since 1945. And if, in terms of the discussions that in terms of the discussion we're having today, I think we need to also look at the current moment as, in part, the outcome of what has come before it. We wouldn't be where we are today with, for example, Israel enjoying total impunity in what it is doing to the Gaza Strip without, let's say, the precedent and the precursor of Iraq 2 decades ago. And again, the UN Security Council is not going to reform itself. And unfortunately, the most effective challenges that are changing the admittedly very flawed international order we had has been to weaken it even further, to make it even more ineffective, to make it even in greater service of those determined to violate the fundamental rights of people who are not part of that power structure, rather than to strengthen it and to make it more equal for all concerned.
Dan, I want to take the discussion in a slightly different direction, but the elephant in the room here has always been the arms trade, money. Money is a huge driver of the wars that we're seeing around the planet. Even from your own website and your own research, the industry is $632 billion worth of trade in 2023. We're looking at a 13% of spending on war and then reconstruction of war of global GDP. That's $19 trillion. Is the money a driving factor, and is it the driving factor? I'll start with you, Dan.
Yes, probably I'm a little bit unfashionable about this because I think I would answer, no, it's not the driving factor. I think it's political ambition is the driving factor that we see. Whether you look at the kind of war of Ukraine, straightforward invasion by one sovereign state against another, if you look at the war that Israel is carrying out against the Palestinians of Gaza and now the West Bank, or you look at civil war in Syria, both from the side of the now defeated Assad and the now victorious what used to be al-Nusra with its jihadi roots. If you look at Sudan and the rivalry of two generals and their militias there, I think persistently you see politics is at the core of it. Power is at the heart of it. Clausewitz, the German military philosopher, said war is the extension of politics by other means. And I think that has stood the test of time and become a cliche only because it's true. That said, money then starts to exacerbate issues, both the resources which are spent on military preparations, which are at an all-time high level. I don't think we've mentioned the figure yet, but let's do just for the fun of it, $2.443 trillion in 2023. And people sometimes ask me, why do I go all nerdish and use the 3 decimal points? And the answer is because those last two, 043, that's $43 billion. And that is something like itself 3 or 4 times as much as is spent on peace operations and peace building worldwide. And then the figure that you mentioned,
sorry, Dan, we are running out of time, and I want to get to that very important point to our other guests. We're spending trillions of dollars, $19 trillion in 2023, Mouin Rabbani, on war. We're not spending anywhere near that on peace building, peace structures, on solving conflicts. That has to be the fact that war is more profitable, surely. That's got to be the simple reason.
Well, it's not only that war is more profitable, but that we also see that those waging war often conclude that war is a more effective method of achieving their objectives than diplomacy or other alternatives. And this, again, reflects the problems with the international system we have, which rewards the powerful and punishes the powerless.
Ravi, the same question to you. Why aren't we spending more money on peace-building efforts? Why aren't we building those institutions? Why are we just spending it on a relentless war machine?
I wish I knew the answer. I mean, I think peace building takes time. It's hard. Reconstruction takes time. Solving big global problems, whether it's climate change, whether it's mitigation, whether it's infrastructure, these things take time. The rewards are unclear. War is instant. You can funnel money from one source to another. There are territorial conquests. And as Dan pointed out as well, people with power and ambition react in strange ways. I don't think it's just money. If you wanted to make more money, you'd put it all in NVIDIA stock. So it isn't as clear cut as that. But I think overall, the thing that concerns me as someone who is, a journalist and an editor is the constant erosion of rules and norms and the sense of impunity it creates. And the longer this goes on, Mouin mentioned Iraq, and you could draw a straight line from there to now in terms of it being okay to do this, it being okay to test the boundaries of the rules and norms that exist, because there aren't enough punishments and there aren't enough agreements on how to even define what is going on around the world. That is a problem. It is a problem we need to talk more about and fix.
Dan, the defining thing for our generation is going to be the genocide in Gaza and how it was allowed to happen. That'll be what people are going to be talking about the same way we talked about the Holocaust, the same way we talked about the Second World War. There'll be failings of institutions that people will talk about. But will there be any accountability, any peace building, any function or organization that will rise from this, like the United Nations did after the Second World War? Or is it erosion that's going to happen?
I think the difficult thing to confront here is that the two moments in the last 100 or so years when a real decisive step has been made in terms of the world order, both came after enormously destructive, multi-party, multi-sided wars. The First World War, which gave rise to the effort with the League of Nations, which failed, and then the Second World War, even more destructive, which gave rise to the United Nations, which, as we said, has been a partial success. It's got some achievements. It's always been flawed. I think that my generation and those born later have not had that experience of war, which told a world in 1945, you know, whatever divides us, we mustn't go through that again. Now, Gaza, what is happening in Gaza is horrible. And I also want to draw attention to what is happening on the West Bank, which in a sometimes smaller way is also extremely serious and inhumane and cruel. But that is I don't want to sound dismissive in this, but that is a localized, horrendous tragedy. And I don't think that that will have that kind of generative effect for the international system and for political leaders all around the world in the way that the Second World War did. So I'm a little bit skeptical about the chances that a new order will be created quickly. I think we've probably got uncomfortably to go through some more erosion before we get there. I hope I'm wrong.
Okay. Just very quickly, because we are running out of time, this is just a very quick question to Ravi and to Mouin. I'll start with Mouin first. Gaza isn't big enough to force a change, but it is the subject that we're going to be talking about of our generation. Is that because it's happening to brown people?
That's certainly part of the explanation. The other part, I think it's too early to tell quite how regional and international crisis is ultimately going to be. But very quickly, I think the question about Gaza, is this another Abyssinia moment where the world order proves its ineffectiveness and collapses because it is essentially toothless? Or is this another 1945 moment where the world looks at what has just happened and decides, you know, things need to change, and the rules are essentially rewritten to ensure that such a thing can never happen again? My money is on this being an Abyssinia moment.
Ravi, what are your thoughts?
Well, you know, we haven't talked about mis and disinformation here, but the truth is we can't even agree on whether Gaza is a genocide. You've called it as such, but much of the Western media will never call it that. The United States will not call it that. And so if you can't agree on facts, I'm not even sure we can say that this is the defining conflict of our generation. What I do think is going to be more indisputable, and I'm not thinking now about the scenes of wildfires in LA. I think the big conflict and war of our generation is actually going to be climate change. I think the scenes of devastation will be so universal, so global, will affect different countries and communities in different ways, that is likely and sadly, very sadly, going to be the thing that will likely bring countries together to act in a way where they can agree on the scope of the problem, and they'll have no other option but to talk about solutions.
I want to thank all our guests, Dan Smith, Ravi Agrawal and Mouin Rabbani. And I want to thank you as well for watching. Now, you can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the whole team here, bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.